Hey guys, Jeff here with the Amethyst Studios. Today we're going to be painting Privateer Prest's Khador Doom Reaver. We're going to focus on his flesh and armor. To start, we're going to do a base coat of 3:1 dwarf flesh to the new Rhinox hide. When applying our base coats, we want to work with thin layers. This provides a good smooth surface for applying the paint later on. So we're just going to apply this to all the flesh areas. On this guy, it's going to be primarily his torso and his arms. Now we're just going to set the model aside to let this layer dry before we move on to applying the wash. Now that the base coat is dry, we're going to work on the wash. For the wash, we are going to do a watered down Rhinox hide, usually about 5:1 water to paint ratio. Now we're just going to liberally apply this to the entire surface of the model. And what this is going to do is provide some nice deep shadows. Already, you can start to see the shadows forming in the recesses of his pectorals and six-pack there. So we'll just let that dry before we continue. As you can see, he's nice and deeply shadowed now. Now we're going to work on the first highlight. This is going to be a reapplication of our base coat, so 3:1 dwarf flesh to Rhinox hide. Using our fine detail brush, we're going to want to focus on all the raised surfaces and all the details that we want to bring the focus to. So that will be areas such as the broad flat surfaces of his pectorals, the smoothness of his belly, and his back shoulder blade. It's also important to not forget the ribs along this side there. They're quite minute and easy to overlook. Now that this layer is done, we're going to focus on our next highlights. What we're going to do is add small amounts of fuchsia body bone into each subsequent highlight. It's going to build towards a nice padded look. We're going to go over all the same areas, focusing on all the same points of interest, but we're going to leave about half of the color we just applied showing through. It's going to create a nice sharp contrast between the shadows and the highlights. With his back, we really want to push the highlights on the upper portions of his shoulder blades to create a really lovely shadow. That layer done, we're going to add more of the bone color into the mix and do the exact same process, except leaving about half of our previous highlight done. It's worth noting we're still working with fairly thin layers here to help with the translucency between each highlight. At this point, we could probably call the flesh done, but I like to push the contrast a little further to make the models really pop on the tabletop. By this point our mix looks more bone than it does the flesh color. And we're really just going to focus on the main points of interest, the tips of the pecs, the rib cage, the little center down the belly, and the top of the shoulder blades. Now we'll take a better look at the finished product. You have some nice deep shadows, some beautiful contrasting highlights from the bone color. Now we're going to focus on the armor. For the armor, we're going to use a base coat of Rhinox hide. We're going to apply this to the skull cap, the shins, the feet, and the left arm. It's going to provide a really nice, rich base for the red we're going to do. The warm tones we're using in his flesh and his armor are going to complement quite well with the cooler tones we're going to achieve later on. This is something you always want to consider when you're painting miniatures, or how the colors you're using are going to relate with one another, as well as how it's going to affect the finished product. For our highlights, we're going to be adding small incremental amounts of the Army Painter War Paint color Dragon Red to our mix. The first highlight is still going to be a little bit of a ruddy brown, but with each layer it'll get more red. And applying it to the miniature, we're going to go over his kneecaps here, and we're going to just do some broad strokes. The main thing here is we want to create the shadows, much like we did with the flesh. I want the Rhinox hide in the shadows and applying the red where the light would be hitting the armor, so such as the top of the head, a little bit along the square base on his collarbone there, the upper ridges of his pauldron and gauntlet and armor there. Once again, we're adding more of the Dragon Red to the mix. Essentially what we're doing is creating our visual points of interest by working the red into very minimal locations. This gives the illusion of light, a slightly reflective surface, and also it gives the brown a chance to enrichen the red colors. I'm a really big fan of the war paint line. The dropper bottle is fantastic, but the paint itself works and covers incredibly well. I highly recommend picking it up. Now that we're on to the next highlight, our mix is starting to look more like Dragon Red and less like a ruddy brown, as you'll see as I begin applying the paint to all of the previous locations we had originally hit. again, we've added more dragon red to our mix, just applying it to the previous areas. This method we're taking is quite similar to the non-metallic approach to painting objects. It is a little bit different in some subtle ways, but some of the core concepts are there, such as creating the visual points of interest and keeping the direction of light in mind when applying the highlights. At this point, we could probably call the armor done. Like I've already mentioned, I really like this dark contrast between highlights and shadows. So we're going to go over with pure dragon red in just the most minute of areas to create a little bit more visual pop. As you can tell, this method for painting red gives you a nice, deep, rich red color as opposed to painting a base red and building up with oranges and yellows, almost getting a cartoony red that way. So this is a perfect way of getting a really rich, lively looking red. There we have it, armor and flesh is done. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned for episode 2, where we'll go over the cooler colors and the base.